I uploaded a tutorial on the camera triggers, and since then, a lot of people have been asking me about the camera guide trigger, and I mean a lot of people. I saw a good chunk of creators don't know how to use it or what it's actually supposed to do. So with that in mind, I'm going to explain everything you need to know about the camera guide trigger. I'm going to talk about what it is and why it's not working for you, as well as what it's actually used for and how to use it in many different ways with real example situations to help you with your building process. We can call this the guide trigger guide video. Sorry. So for starters, what is the camera guide trigger? And the answer is that it's exactly as in the name. It's a guide you can use to help you when using camera triggers in a level. That's it. It's not really a trigger in the sense that triggers usually interact with other things in the editor like objects, but even so, it can be an incredibly helpful tool to use. So as it said in the official GD editor guide, the guide trigger does not serve any other purpose besides functioning as a guide to see the camera edges of different zooms. So what does that mean? It means that it doesn't actually affect the camera in any way. So placing a guide trigger isn't going to make the camera do anything at all. And this is where a lot of people get confused. They place the trigger thinking it's going to do something, but it doesn't, and then people think they're doing something wrong or it's not working. But it's not supposed to. At least not like that. And here is where I get into a very important part. The difference between the static trigger and the guide trigger. Just in case you don't know how the static camera trigger works, it essentially uses an object with the group ID as the center of the camera. This means that to actually move the camera to a certain position, you need to use the static trigger, not the camera guide. And now we get into the real use of the guide trigger and why it's actually really useful. The guide trigger can also be used as the target group for the static camera trigger to always have a good understanding of what the screen will look like. This means you can use the guide trigger as the center object of the camera by adding a group ID to it, then putting that ID as the target ID inside the static trigger. So both work together. The static trigger is going to actually move the camera, and the guide trigger will be used as a reference for you to know what the camera will actually look like in those settings. And if you change the zoom or offset values with other triggers, you can also adjust those values in the guide trigger to make the reference still accurate. Using the guide as the sender opens a lot of possibilities, and I'll teach you how to do all of this later in the video, but to use it to its full potential, we first need to understand what these rectangles mean. And it's quite simple. The green rectangle represents the guaranteed 4x3 view. This means that whatever is inside the green area will be visible in any devices. So if you have, for instance, UI elements that are near the corners of the screen, it's a good move to either place them within this rectangle so it's seen in any device, or to make a 4x3 fix, which I'll talk about later in this video. The outer rectangle, the orange one, is based on your screen's aspect ratio, meaning that it actually changes from device to device. So the outer rectangle will always be proportional to your own screen size. For example, if I place a guide trigger on my phone, the size will be different from if I did it on my computer. This is good to playtest across different devices if you need. Now the yellow line just represents the player offset. That's a reference of where the player is going to be in relation to the camera, depending on the camera offset value that you decide to use. Now that we understand how the trigger works and what it's actually used for, let's see how you can actually apply this knowledge in different situations. Let's say you want to lock a camera to a specific point in this room. You've learned that to do this, you just need to place an object, give it a group ID, and then put that ID in the static trigger. But then you don't really know what it's actually going to show because there's no indication of the area that the camera is going to cover. You can easily solve this problem by just using the guide trigger as the center instead of a random object. Now that I removed the object and added the group ID to the guide trigger, the camera is going to lock to the guide, and now we know how much it's actually going to cover. And another situation is for cutscenes or camera movement animations, that kind of stuff. Let's say you want to have a little cutscene to introduce the player to a cave. So for instance, the camera is going to go from point A to point B and zoom out on its way there, and then go from point B to point C and then zoom in, and then go back to point A with its original settings. That might have sounded pretty complex, but it's pretty simple to do. Place the guide triggers wherever you want them. So here I have mine at point A and then point B. And then at point B, I did a little zoom out to cover the whole thing at the top and bottom there. Then point C is just back to normal zoom. And again, the idea is for it to go back to point A. So you can just select all of these guide triggers and then click on new group X. Then that's going to give a different group. So the first one is group 1, second one is group 2, third one is group 3, as you can see at the corner right there. This is going to vary, of course, because it's going to use the next free groups in your level, but in this case it's group 1, 2, and 3. So what I want to do is, as soon as the player lands, the camera is going to be static instead of following the player, and then it's going to do that little animation of just showing the whole place. So what I can do is just first put a static trigger to make it lock to point A. So this is guide trigger number 1, which is set to group 1. So we're going to go on static trigger, put a number 1 on the target group ID. So we're going to do 1 second smooth velocity. We're doing smooth velocity just because the camera is already moving down fast. If you click the help button, you can see that smooth velocity makes the transition to the target adapt to the current camera velocity. So in this case, that's very important. So I'm going to make this one touch triggered because I want it to only happen once the player touches the hitbox of the trigger right there. So as the player falls, you can see the camera is now static. No matter where I go, it's going to stay there. But now what I want to do is right before the player hits this checkpoint, it's going to go and show the whole cutscene. So a really simple way to do this without using move triggers is just placing the static trigger. And then we're going to make it target group 2 now because we want it to go from this guide trigger all the way to that guide trigger. So instead of targeting group 1, it's targeting group 2 now. So we're going to make this duration 5 seconds. Then going to add some easing just to make the movement a little bit smoother. But I don't want this trigger to just happen randomly. I want it to happen at a specific place. So we're going to make it spawn triggered, meaning it's only going to happen if another trigger spawns it. So this is spawn triggered now. And then we're going to give it a group ID. So the trigger has its own group ID. That's going to be 4 in this case. So I can place a spawn trigger right here to activate this static trigger. So this one we already know is group 4 right there. So we can change this spawn group to spawn group ID number 4, and we gotta make this spawn trigger touch triggered because we only want that to activate once the player reaches this point. And you might be thinking, well, couldn't I just put the static trigger over there and make it touch triggered? You could, but in this case it wouldn't work because we are gonna have several other triggers in this same spawn. So I mentioned we also want to zoom out, so we're gonna change the zoom to 0.7 because that's the zoom that I figured looks good using the guide trigger. So we're gonna put the zoom here, and then we're gonna change this to 0.7. And we're going to do the same thing. 5 seconds, ease in out. Again, make sure this is spawn triggered and is at group 4. So it gets spawned as well. So once that movement is done, I want it to do another movement. So we're going to just duplicate that and just move it all the way over this side. Let me just move this up real quick just for organization. So now this is very important right here. You're going to go to the spawn trigger and edit object and then spawn ordered. Otherwise, it's going to spawn every trigger at the same time because that's what the spawn trigger does. It activates other triggers simultaneously regardless of the X position. If you do spawn ordered, it actually spawns them in order. Wow. I explained that very well. You're very welcome. So once that movement stops, I want to just start the movement to go towards point C. So I'm going to change the static from group 2 to group 3. And then the zoom is going to go back out to 1. Then I can duplicate this once again. This time I can just delete the zoom trigger because it's already at 1. And then I can just exit static to make it go back to the player. So it basically ignores everything else. It's just gonna exit static in 4 seconds with ease in out. So now if we save and play this, you're gonna see that at first I can't move, I can't do anything. But once I go to that point and hit the spawn trigger, it's now doing a very smooth kind of showcase of the whole area. And this is really cool when you're making platformers especially. And doing that before the checkpoint also makes so if I die, the cutscene doesn't repeat, which is something that is very important to do because no one wants to keep replaying a 15-second cutscene when you're playing a level, especially if it's a hard one. Another insanely cool usage of the guide trigger is making UI elements. UI elements are things that allow the player to interact with the level and help with giving information. And they're usually always on the player screen like the hotbar in Minecraft. You can easily set up UI elements using the camera guide and the UI trigger. Just place both down and put what you want to use as your UI element in the position you want. In this case, I'm using a health text and I want it to be on the top left of the screen. Now, all you have to do is assign the groups. Give the UI a group, and give the camera guide another group, and put those inside the UI trigger, and boom, the UI is set, and this will always follow your screen no matter what zoom or camera setting you use. But if you want to remove that later, of course, you can always use the toggle or alpha trigger to hide it. Now, I also mentioned a 4x3 fix earlier, which is something you can easily do by using toggle or move triggers to change the position of things that would otherwise be outside of the screen to be within the 4x3 aspect ratio, just in case someone who has 4x3 is playing your level and then it's actually outside of 4x3 on accident. Now, if you want to learn how to use all of the different camera triggers, make sure to watch this video right here in which I explain how everything regarding the camera works. A very special thanks to all the channel members, especially Carmen, Electroblocks, and Fireshape. I really appreciate the extra support you guys give, and it really helps me out. Thank you for watching. See ya.